Hi guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I wanted to do a side-by-side review of two books I read recently. The first one being Convenience Store Woman by Sayaka Murata, and the second one being Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman. Eleanor Oliphant has of course been completely ubiquitous over the past year or so, and Convenience Store Woman was just released in English in the United States after having sold over 600,000 copies in Japan. So both of these books have been very successful so far, and they both follow single 30-something women who are considered to be social misfits and whose lives don't necessarily line up with what people consider to be normal or successful. And I read these books one after another because I was really curious to see how each would approach topics like loneliness and isolation and social expectations and alienation. And as it turns out, Murata and Honeyman both have very different things to say about those themes, and I found one of their approaches to be more thought-provoking and interesting than the others, so let's get into it. I want to start with Convenience Store Woman because that's the book I read first, and this is a very slim, almost novella-length story about Kiko, who is a 36-year-old woman who has been working in the same Tokyo convenience store for the past 18 years. And beyond having no real career ambitions to speak of, she also lives alone, she has few close friends, and she's never been involved in any romantic or sexual relationship of any kind. So Kiko is, by most people's standards, quite abnormal, and she's been that way her entire life. She's very sharp and observant, but has trouble relating to people on an emotional level, and she's also logical and pragmatic, almost to a satirical extreme. Basically, all Kiko wants is to be a useful member of society, and so when she starts working at the convenience store when she's 18, she has this epiphany. That moment, for the first time ever, I felt I'd become a part in the machine of society. I've been reborn, I thought. That day, I actually became a normal cog in society. And so from this point onward, the convenience store becomes the driving purpose in Kiko's life, and it becomes the only identity that really matters to her. And the passages in which Murata describes Kiko readying the store for opening, or operating the till, or anticipating customers' needs with a sort of eagle-eyed sensitivity, not only evokes in a delightful way the very ordered and sterile sort of capitalist utopia that is a Japanese convenience store, but it also conveys the real satisfaction that Kiko derives from doing her job well. And despite her many oddities, she's not a complete social outcast, partly because she's learned how to imitate others and sort of mimic their turns of phrase and their gestures when she needs to interact with people in normal society. But while Kiko is very content with her simple and solitary life, her failure to conform to broader social norms and social rules becomes a point of increasing concern for her friends and her sister, who view her job as sort of a dead end and who would rather see her find a man and settle down. And so in an effort to appease them, Kiko decides to let a male co-worker and fellow misfit named Shihara move in with her. Shihara is a lazy and entitled misogynist who rails against the society and the women that he feels have rejected him, and he and Kiko really are just using each other to get everyone else off their backs. And it mostly works to a kind of hilarious and disturbing degree, because even though Shihara is an asshole and a loafer, Kiko's friends and sister are thrilled for her because everyone is much happier to think of her as a normal person with problems rather than an abnormal person without problems. But the perils of trying to play along become painfully apparent when Shihara convinces Kiko to quit her job at the convenience store, and her life subsequently falls apart. And without giving too much away, this book reaches a sort of satirical climax that is both strangely comforting and also very unsettling, and I would say that whether you interpret it as a happy or sad ending probably says more about you than it does about Kiko herself. Because certainly Kiko's approach to her life and her total attachment to the convenience store isn't exactly what I would call healthy, but her commitment to her job isn't all that different from that of all the other workaholics in Tokyo. Yes, the constant cycling in and out of goods and people from the convenience store is a sort of constant reminder to Kiko that she is just a temporary part that will eventually be replaced and forgotten as well, but at least Kiko knows that we're all just cogs in the machine in some way, and she knows that none of us are really that important, and she's okay with that. Ultimately, this isn't so much a realistic character study as it is a mirror held up to society and the reader. And Murata's prose is so simple and conversational that I think it's easy to read this book really quickly and kind of think, what a weird story, because it is pretty weird. But beneath its quirky sheen, this book is darkly funny in the way that it satirizes capitalist society and in the way that it critiques the sort of arbitrary social rules by which we construct definitions of normal and abnormal people, meaningful and meaningless lives. But switching gears, where Convenience Store Woman explores the hypocrisies of modern mainstream society, Eleanor Oliphant is completely fine, offers a more intimate psychological portrait of an abnormal woman trying to navigate and find her place in normal society. The story follows a 30-year-old woman named Eleanor Oliphant who lives a very solitary and isolated life. She lives alone, she spends every weekend holed up in her apartment drinking vodka, and her only close relation is her mother, who she telephones once a week and who, right from the jump, proves to be a very ominous figure in this book. And it's through the early introduction of the mummy character that readers get their first indication that Eleanor not only is a loner, but also has a very dark and troubled past. And on that note, I didn't really realize going in how dark and almost sinister certain aspects of this book are, especially with regard to Eleanor's backstory, which is hinted at and slowly revealed throughout the book, and it proves to be so over the top in its level of trauma, and the mother figure proves to be so cartoonishly evil that it really took it out of the realm of believability for me. And listen, that's not to say that some people don't have horrible and abusive parents, but I just didn't see why Eleanor's past needed to be so extreme. I thought that Gail Honeyman could have written a very similar character study without needing to construct such a traumatic and almost melodramatic backstory. But I know that a lot of people didn't really have an issue with how trauma is used in this book, so I will say that the other more critical and fatal way that I thought this book tests believability is through the character of Eleanor herself. Eleanor, at least to me, just doesn't feel like a real person. It seems like Honeyman was trying to create a character who has trouble relating to people or connecting with people, or who perhaps doesn't always pick up on social cues, but instead of creating a realistic portrait of a person like that, I felt like Honeyman often just sort of painted Eleanor as this person who is totally inept. For instance, there's this scene where she goes to a bar and orders a beer, and when she's given a bottle of beer and a glass, she's like baffled and doesn't know what she's supposed to do. Like, to me, that seems less like someone who doesn't understand social cues and more like someone who doesn't have an ounce of common sense. But even that social ineptness is written in a sort of inconsistent way. Sometimes she's presented as being very keen and observant. For example, she's perceptive enough to note that people who go on Antiques Roadshow lie about wanting to keep family heirlooms after finding out that they're worth a fortune. But then at other times, she's written as someone who seems like she was literally born yesterday, because she doesn't understand things as basic as like what air quotes mean or what the term seeing someone means. She's also presented as someone who is quite jaded and cynical and hypercritical of other people, but then we're also supposed to believe that she's idealistic and naive enough to fall for this rock musician who's clearly an idiot and who she's never met before. And listen, I understand that humans are naturally complicated and contradictory creatures, but to me, Eleanor's inconsistencies felt less like a sign of her humanity and more just like a failure of characterization on Honeyman's part. And that's kind of a bummer because, like I mentioned, this book really is mostly focused on Eleanor's arc and her development as a character, and it really doesn't have that much to say about the broader themes of isolation or alienation or sort of social abnormality. I mean, every once in a while, Eleanor will make a kind of snarky comment about the stupid aspects of the social world, but they never really rise above her observing things like kitten heels are stupid or waxing is awful, as if all of us didn't already know that patriarchal beauty standards are bullshit. Like, otherwise, I would say the main insights of this book are like make a friend and go to therapy. And to be fair, I did like the character of Raymond, who becomes Eleanor's sort of first real friend, but beyond that, I just found this book kind of trite and overly predictable. And of course, by doing this two-part review, I don't mean to directly compare Convenience Store Woman and Eleanor Oliphant, because I think it's important to note that these two books are trying to accomplish very different things despite their sort of slightly similar premises. And where Eleanor Oliphant is more sentimental and predictable and ultimately kind of celebrates what's great about fitting in, Convenience Store Woman, under its whimsical veneer, is more willing to really explore the dark sides of both conformity and nonconformity and all the sort of gray area in between. So ultimately, these are very different books, but I did find Convenience Store Woman to be more interesting and original, and I found Eleanor Oliphant to be largely a letdown. But I do know that a lot of people love that book, and I understand why people love it. So if you have thoughts on that, or if you have thoughts on Convenience Store Woman or are interested in reading that, let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!